Chuck Berry laughed at Jimi Hendrix at a Chicago radio station in 1967, and Jimi's response silenced everyone in the building. Charles Edward Anderson Berry had not built rock and roll the way a carpenter builds a house, with blueprints and deliberate planning and a clear sense of the finished thing. He had built it the way a river builds a canyon, by moving with absolute conviction in a single direction and letting everything in his path become part of the shape he was carving. The duck walk, the double-string guitar runs, the songs about cars and girls and the sweet geography of American teenage life. He had assembled these elements in the early 1950s when nobody had a name yet for what he was doing, and by the time the name arrived, rock and roll, it already had his fingerprints on every surface. By 1967, Chuck Berry was 40 years old and watching something complicated happen to the music he had helped to create. The British invasion had taken American rhythm and blues, combined it with a European sensibility, and sent it back across the Atlantic at enormous commercial volume. The Rolling Stones covered his songs. The Beatles cited him as a primary influence. Hundreds of younger musicians on both sides of the ocean had built careers on foundations that he had laid in his 20s at Chess Records in Chicago, in a recording studio that smelled of cigarettes and possibility. Berry had complicated feelings about all of it. The recognition was genuine and gratifying. The royalty situation was less gratifying. And there was something else, harder to name, a sense that the music had traveled so far from its origins that the people now playing it had lost the specific thread that connected the sound to its source. Rock and roll had begun as something particular, had grown in particular soil, had expressed particular things about a particular American experience. The versions that were now filling stadiums felt to Berry like elaborations that had forgotten the text they were elaborating on. He was at WLS Radio in Chicago for a promotional appearance in the spring of 1967, the kind of obligation that came with being a legend. Sit across from a disc jockey, talk about your music, remind people that you existed and had new material worth hearing. The studio was small and familiar, the equipment the same vintage as the rooms where he had made his earliest records, and the disc jockey was the kind of enthusiast who had grown up listening to Berry's records and could not quite conceal his excitement at being in the same room with the man who made them. Jimi Hendrix was there because the same disc jockey had arranged for him to be there, hoping for exactly the kind of generational encounter that radio programmers dream about, the originator and the innovator in the same room, talking about where music had come from and where it was going. Jimi had arrived early and was sitting in the corner of the control room with his guitar across his lap, listening to Berry's interview through the glass, saying nothing. Berry noticed him during a break in the conversation. He looked at the guitar case, then at Jimi's face, then back at the disc jockey with an expression that contained an entire editorial. "This is the new thing," Berry said, not unkindly, but with the particular directness of a man who had earned the right to say what he actually thought. "This is what they're calling a guitar player now?" The disc jockey laughed nervously. Jimi, through the glass, couldn't hear what was being said, but he could read the room well enough. Berry turned back to the microphone. The interview resumed. And then he said it, on air, in the casual way that people say things when they're comfortable enough in their own authority to not worry about the consequences. "These kids today," Berry said, "they took what I built and they forgot where it came from. They put on the lights and the costumes and they play the notes, but the notes don't mean anything without understanding what put those notes there in the first place. You can learn every lick I ever played. That doesn't make you a guitar player. That makes you a student who memorized somebody else's homework." He laughed.
It was a genuine laugh, not performed, the laugh of someone who has just expressed something he has been thinking for a long time and finds the relief of saying it out loud almost physically pleasant. The disc jockey, aware that Jimi Hendrix was 20 feet away on the other side of a pane of glass and could almost certainly read lips, made the calculation that an interviewer makes when a situation is getting more interesting than he planned for. He suggested that maybe Jimi could come in and they could talk about it together. Barry shrugged with the magnanimity of someone who has no doubt about how the conversation will go. "Bring him in," he said. Jimi came through the door carrying his guitar. He shook Barry's hand with genuine respect. This was not a moment of confrontation for him, not yet, because Jimi had grown up with Chuck Berry's records the way he had grown up with the weather, as part of the ambient reality of being a musician in America. He sat across from Barry, and the disc jockey put a second microphone on the table between them. "I was just saying," Barry told him, in the tone of a man picking up a conversation rather than starting one, "that the young players today have learned the vocabulary without understanding the language. You can repeat words all day. That's not the same as having something to say." "I think I understand what you mean," Jimi said. "Do you?" Barry said, and it was not exactly a challenge. It was more like a genuine question from someone who was not in the habit of assuming that younger musicians understood anything he hadn't explicitly explained to them. "I think the vocabulary is the beginning, not the end, but I think you have to actually know the vocabulary before you can move past it." Barry looked at him. Something in the specificity of that response had registered differently than he expected. "You know the vocabulary?" Barry said. "Some of it," Jimi said. The disc jockey, who had been watching this exchange with the focused attention of someone who senses that his studio is about to become a landmark, made the obvious question. "Would you play something?" There was a moment, brief but real, where the room recalibrated around the possibility. Then Jimi picked up his guitar. He played Johnny Be Good. Not a version of it, not an interpretation of it, not a demonstration of what could be done with it when you applied modern techniques and extended its harmonic possibilities into territories Barry never explored. He played it the way it had been played when Barry recorded it in 1958, with the same opening run that had become one of the most recognizable guitar figures in the history of popular music, with the same rhythmic attack and the same propulsive energy that had made the song feel like a car accelerating onto a highway.
He played it perfectly. Every note in its right place, every accent landing where Barry had placed it 9 years earlier. The feel was exact, not copied in the mechanical sense of someone who has studied a recording until they can reproduce its surface, but understood in the deeper sense of someone who has heard what was behind the notes and why they were arranged the way they were. Chuck Berry sat very still. Then Jimi kept playing, and this was when everything changed. He didn't stop at the end of the first verse and the first chorus. He took the song apart the way a watchmaker takes apart a movement, carefully, with full knowledge of how it fit together, and then he began to put it back together in ways that showed what was inside it. He found chord voicings within the song's structure that Barry had never used, but that were there, available, waiting in the harmonic logic of what Barry had written. He found rhythmic variations that multiplied the song's forward momentum while maintaining its essential character. He found melodic extensions that took the guitar figure of the opening run and developed it across the whole song's length, the way a jazz musician develops a theme. He played for 5 minutes. He did not play loudly. He was in a radio studio, and he played at radio studio volume, which meant that every detail was audible, every choice was clear, and there was nowhere to hide anything that wasn't actually there. The disc jockey did not say anything. The engineer in the booth, a man named Gerald, who had been working at WLS for 11 years and had seen and heard considerable amounts of music pass through that room, set down the coffee cup he had been holding and did not pick it up again. Chuck Berry had his arms crossed when Jimi began to play. By the time Jimi was 2 minutes in, his arms were uncrossed.
By the time Jimi finished, Barry was leaning forward with his elbows on the table, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been shown something in familiar territory that he had not seen before. The silence after Jimi stopped lasted long enough that the disc jockey eventually said something simply to fill it, because silence on radio is a technical problem, regardless of its cause. Chuck Berry sat back in his chair. He looked at his own hands for a moment, the hands that had played these same chord shapes in this same city, in a studio a few miles from where they were sitting 9 years ago. "Where did you learn that?" he said. His voice was different from how it had been before. The comfortable authority was still there, but it had been joined by something more careful, the tone of a man who is revising a conclusion in real time and wants to understand what caused the revision. "From you," Jimi said. "From the record. I must have listened to that song 200 times before I understood what you were actually doing in it." Barry said nothing for a moment. "You heard what I was doing," he said. Finally, it wasn't a question. It was something closer to confirmation, the particular relief of a person who has been creating things for decades and has not always been certain that anyone was receiving them at the level at which they were transmitted. "The notes are the easy part. What you put underneath the notes, that took me a long time to hear." Chuck Berry had spent 15 years watching younger musicians engage with his music. He had watched him learn his licks and deploy them in their own recordings and build careers on the vocabulary he had established, and the experience had left him with a settled, not entirely comfortable sense that the music had been taken somewhere he hadn't chosen to send it. What was happening in this radio studio in Chicago was something different. Jimi Hendrix had not taken the music somewhere. He had gone back to where it came from, understood it at the level of origin, and then shown Barry what it contained that even Barry hadn't fully articulated.
"I owe you an apology," Barry said. He said it without preamble, in the direct way that direct people make admissions when they've decided to make them. "I was making a general statement earlier that wasn't about you specifically. I didn't know you specifically." "You couldn't have," Jimi said. "I know now," Barry said. The disc jockey had the presence of mind to keep the tape running through all of it, and the recording of that afternoon at WLS became one of the most discussed pieces of audio in the oral history of rock and roll. Not because of any single dramatic moment, but because of the sustained quality of what it captured. Two musicians, separated by 15 years and by everything that had happened to their shared music in those 15 years, finding the place where they were working on the same thing. Barry spoke about that afternoon in interviews for the rest of his career, always with the specific care of someone trying to say something true about a complicated experience. He said that Jimi had given him back something he hadn't known he'd lost, which was the certainty that the music had traveled to someone who understood what it was actually saying, not just what it sounded like. "I built something," Barry said once, "and I spent a long time thinking nobody had received it right. That afternoon in Chicago, I found out I was wrong. He'd received it better than I knew how to send it." Jimi Hendrix went on to reshape what the electric guitar was understood to be capable of, and the vocabulary he had learned from Chuck Berry's records was part of the foundation underneath everything he built. Chuck Berry went on to be recognized as one of the essential architects of popular music, the man who had given rock and roll a language before it had a name. They had been, without knowing it, working on the same sentence. Jimi had just found the end of it. If this story of what it means to truly inherit a musical tradition moved you, please subscribe and hit that like button. Share this with someone who knows the difference between learning the notes and understanding the music. Have you ever encountered something familiar from a completely new angle that made you understand it for the first time? Tell us in the comments.
Ring that notification bell for more stories about the moments when music passed something essential from one generation to the next.